Imagine you were tasked with designing the most efficient prison system. Let's say a prison that can hold the most amount of prisoners while simultaneously requiring the least amount of guards. Now, I'm sure a lot of you can come up with really creative ideas, and so did an English philosopher in the 18th century. His name was Jeremy Bentham, and he came up with a revolutionary prison design that he called the panopticon. Now, this is what a panopticon looks like. As you can see, it has a circular design with the prison cells along the circumference, with the guard tower in the center. Now, it was designed in such a way that every prisoner can see, prisoners could not see the guards in the tower, but the guards could see every single prisoner around them. This design was ruthlessly effective. In fact, it was controversial, and it gathered a lot of criticism, primarily for its blatant disregard for privacy. You see, the prisoners were subjected to surveillance throughout the day for years on end, which resulted in many prisoners suffering from mental illnesses. To put it in the words of a critic, the panopticon was a device of monstrous efficiency that it left no room for humanity. But this was back in the 18th century. The panopticon, well, it's a lot like my grandpa now. It's an old-fashioned relic, and it doesn't exist anymore. Even though the structural design doesn't exist, it's faded out into history, the philosophy behind it, the idea that you can induce control in people just by surveillance, it's a sentiment that exists, and it has implications in the modern world. We all have access to the internet, right? I mean, unless they forgot to give you the Wi-Fi password. But anything we do on the internet, like social media or browsing the internet or online shopping, all of these actions leave us vulnerable to varying degrees of surveillance. Now, unlike conventional surveillance where you point a camera at someone, well, this kind of digital surveillance comes in a more sinister form. Now, think of a way when you the term is called dataveillance, which simply means surveillance through data. Now, to understand what data means, think of every small action that you do on the internet, like clicking on a link, or the time you spend looking at an Instagram post. All of these actions generate a little bit of information that in the tech industry is called data. Now, this collection of data on you creates an outline of you that represents what you want, what you like. Think of it like a digital form of a panopticon, where we are the prisoners. But unlike the panopticon design that I explained in the beginning, it's not quite comparable. Because, you see, when we are prisoners, we're not aware of the surveillance. Or maybe a lot of us are aware of the surveillance, but we're not aware of the full extent of the data that is collected on us. Or, more importantly, we're not aware of where this data goes or who has access to this data. Now, think of a scenario where your personal information is accessible on the internet, available for everyone. Now, I'm sure it's a very scary scenario to imagine. Well, I wouldn't have to imagine that, because right now, at this very moment, my personal information, like my full name, my date of birth, home address, etc., or along with the similar details of 533 million Facebook users, are sitting somewhere on the internet, accessible to anyone who comes across it. Now, this is because last year, in 2021, Facebook faced one of the biggest data breaches ever. Now, the hackers collected all this data and uploaded it onto the internet. Now, there are sites where you can check your email or phone number to see if it was part of the data breach. And sure enough, mine was. And it's scary to imagine all these information just available on the internet, accessible by people like a scammer or a stalker. We need to understand that companies like Google and Facebook, as big as they are are still vulnerable to hacks and data breaches, and our private details are not as secure as we think it is. Now, it's not just the information that we give these companies willingly. More than that, these companies track down and collect our usage patterns, our search histories, our interests. And we tend to assume, well, it's different because these companies want this data just for promoting posts or advertisements, right? No, that's not right, because Google themselves admit to selling user information to government agencies and law enforcement. In fact, last year, in 2021, Google was reported to have 300,000 requests from governments around the world requesting user information. Now, I'm sure it sounds very scary to you, but let me tell you this, it's not surprising. Because as much as private companies want our information, our data for profit, governments also want a share in this data, but not for the same reasons. And this is where we get to a more sinister aspect of data collection and surveillance. Because think of governments and surveillance like pineapple and pizza. You should keep them as far away as possible. Because surveillance can be used as a means of censorship. Let me give you an example. In the June of 2013, you might have even heard of this, Edward Snowden revealed to the world the massive amounts of information like photos, emails, phone records collected by intelligence agencies on who? On criminals? No, on their own citizens. Now, it's scary to imagine like your own government doing this to you, but this is what happens. And we need to be aware of this data collection that can happen at any time. Our phones are, we have the technology right now. Our phones respond to us. Hey, Alexa. Hey, Google. Hey, Siri. Or if you're crazy enough, hey, Bixby. So we have laid the groundwork. All we need is a government that is willing enough to go the extra mile to surveil on its own citizens. And that is possible. So when I mentioned this June 2013 incident, there's even a movie about it, Snowden. What I'm more interested about is the aftermath. Because a research done 2 years later, in 2015, revealed that they compared the search results from before and after this incident. They found out that select keywords like terrorism, car bomb, Taliban had decreased in search results. Even pages that mention these keywords also decreased in search results. Now think about it. The surveillance causes people to censor their thoughts and speech. If people are spooked from learning about important policy matters like national security and terrorism, it's a real threat to inform citizens and having proper debates on these issues. Surveillance causes people to censor themselves. This form of self-censorship prevents societies from having proper freedom to express and criticize regulatory bodies, which is an essential part of democracy. Now, keep in mind, when I talk about data collection, not all data collection is harmful. And sometimes data collection can also be useful, is necessary at times. For example, Google Maps. We all use Google Maps. When we use Google Maps, the application sends our location data in order to identify traffic jams. It's a convenient feature that requires data collection. And in the modern world, trying to avoid data collection is like trying to find a good Cardi B song. You can't. It's impossible. So data collection is not always bad, but the problem is when companies cross boundaries to collect more data than they're required to. A popular example is this app that I keep hearing about, TikTok. you might be using it, but it has been found to collect more information, unnecessary amounts of information about its users than it's required to. It's so common to hear and read about news headlines where some company or the other is involved in breaching user privacy. I mean, at some point we need to realize that this cannot be the norm. Journalism, political activism, and simply to voice our opinions require, at some degree, privacy, because it empowers us to speak our mind without compromising on our identity. We desire privacy because the desire comes from a need for freedom. If we need to value privacy as more than just a privilege, because it is a right, and only when we view it as a right, only then we can assign consequences to governments and corporations that disrespect it. So we need to view it not as a privilege, but as our right. Thank you for listening.